In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where secrets hide behind lace curtains and every neighbour knows more than they let on, Miss Jane Marple sits with her knitting, her sharp eyes missing nothing. When a strange glove with only 2 fingers appears, it sparks whispers of scandal, theft and deception. What begins as a trivial curiosity unravels into a complex mystery, with Miss Marple's keen mind piecing together clues that others overlook. Join her as she navigates village gossip, cryptic strangers, and hidden truths in this gripping tale of intrigue. Chapter 1. The Village Whisper. The late summer sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, its rays filtering through the ancient elms that lined the high street. The village was a picture of tranquility. Roses bloomed in neat gardens, the church bell tolled softly for evensong, and the faint clatter of teacups drifted from open windows. Yet, beneath this serene surface, there was a hum of something not quite right, a ripple in the usual calm that Miss Jane Marple, seated by her window with her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, could not ignore. Miss Marple's cottage, with its whitewashed walls and thatched roof, stood at the heart of the village, a vantage point from which she observed the comings and goings of her neighbours. Her eyes, bright and bird-like behind her spectacles, missed little. She had a way of noticing things, the way Mrs. Price's curtains twitched when the postman lingered too long, or how young Tommy Pierce's bicycle wobbled when he carried an extra bundle of newspapers. Today, however, it was not a curtain or a bicycle that caught her attention, but a snippet of conversation drifting from the post office across the lane. She had gone to post a letter to her nephew, Raymond West, and was lingering by the counter, pretending to examine a display of penny stamps, when she overheard Mrs. Murgatroyd, the postmistress, speaking in hushed tones to Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife. "It's the queerest thing, Clara," Mrs. Murgatroyd was saying, her voice low but carrying in the small shop. "Found it this morning just lying there on the path by the vicarage. A glove, but not like any I've seen before. Only 2 fingers, it had, thumb and forefinger, clear as day, but the rest just sewn shut. Who wears a thing like that?" Mrs. Clement, a kind woman with a penchant for nervous fluttering, adjusted her hat and leaned closer. 2 fingers. How peculiar. Was it a man-sit's glove or a woman-sit's? And whose could it be? Nobody in St. Mary Mead would wear such a thing, surely. "That's just it," Mrs. Murgatroyd replied, her eyes wide with the thrill of gossip. "It's fine leather, mind you, not cheap. But why only 2 fingers? I took it to the vicar, thinking someone might have dropped it after church, but he hadn't a clue. Said it gave him a queer feeling, like it meant something sinister." Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. A glove with 2 fingers. It was an oddity, certainly, but in her experience oddities were rarely without purpose. She adjusted her shawl and stepped closer to the counter, her expression one of mild curiosity. "Clement," she said, her voice gentle but carrying that quiet authority that made people listen. "I couldn't help overhearing. Did you say a glove with only 2 fingers?" Mrs. Murgatroyd, delighted to have a new audience, nodded vigorously. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's the strangest thing. Here, I've got it under the counter, didn't know what to do with it." She reached down and produced a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, which she unwrapped to reveal a single black leather glove. It was, as she'd described, finely made, with a soft, supple texture and meticulous stitching. But where one would expect spaces for 5 fingers, there were only 2, a thumb and a forefinger, with the remaining 3 digits replaced by a smooth, seamless panel of leather. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly as she examined it. "How extraordinary," she murmured. "It sits almost as if it were made for a specific purpose. Not for warmth, surely, nor for fashion. Perhaps for some sort of work?" "Work?" Mrs. Clement echoed, her hands fluttering to her throat. "What kind of work would need a glove like that? It sets unsettling. Unset, you think?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone light but her mind already turning. "Or perhaps it sits simply a curiosity." "Where exactly did you find it, Mrs. Murgatroyd?" "On the path leading to the vicarage gate," the postmistress replied. "Right by that old oak tree, half hidden in the grass. I thought at first it was just a scrap of leather, but when I picked it up, well, you can see for yourself." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers tracing the air above the glove as if to commit its details to memory. "And no one has claimed it?" "Not a soul," Mrs. Murgatroyd said. "I asked around Mrs. Price, the butcher, even young Tommy, but nobody sits seen its like. It sits got the village in a tizzy. I can tell you." Mrs. Clement lowered her voice. "Do you think it could belong to that new gentleman, Mr. Hawthorne? He said's only been here a week, and nobody knows much about him. They say he set's an antiquarian, but he keeps to himself, doesn't set he?" Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. She had already noted the arrival of Mr. Cedric Hawthorne, a tall, angular man with a penchant for dark coats and a reserved manner. He had taken the old Miller cottage at the edge of the village, and while he was polite enough, his reluctance to join in village life had sparked curiosity. "It's a bit early to point fingers, don't you think?" she said mildly. "Though I dare say a glove like this might belong to anyone or no one we know yet." The conversation was interrupted by the jingle of the post office bell as young Tommy Pierce burst in, his face flushed from cycling. "Mrs. Murgatroyd, there's a parcel for you at the station," he announced, then caught sight of the glove on the counter. "Caw, what's that? Looks like something a ghost wear." Mrs. Murgatroyd shushed him, but Miss Marple chuckled softly. "A ghost, Tommy. I think it's far more likely to belong to someone with a very particular reason for wearing it." She turned to Mrs. Murgatroyd. "Might I suggest leaving it with the vicar for now? Someone may come looking for it, and it would be a shame to misplace such a curious item." As she left the post office, Miss Marple's mind was abuzz. A glove with 2 fingers was no ordinary object. It suggested intention, perhaps secrecy. She thought of her nephew Raymond's tales of criminal cases, where the smallest detail, a button, a cigarette stub, had unravelled grand schemes. This glove, she felt certain, was such a detail. But whose hand had it fit, and why? Back in her cottage, she settled into her armchair. Her knitting resumed, but her thoughts were far from the wool in her hands. She recalled a story from years ago about a gardener in Much Benham who wore a modified glove to protect an injured hand while pruning roses. Could this be something similar? Or was it, as Mrs. Clement feared, something altogether more sinister? The village clock struck noon, and Miss Marple glanced out her window. Across the lane, she saw Mrs. Price's curtains twitch again, and a moment later, Mr. Hawthorne himself appeared, striding purposefully toward the vicarage. His left hand was gloved, but from this distance she couldn't tell if it was the peculiar 2-fingered kind. She made a mental note to invite him for tea soon. People she knew revealed more over a cup of Darjeeling than they ever intended. As she knitted, her mind wove a pattern of possibilities. The glove was a clue, but to what? A theft? A deception? Or something stranger still? In St. Mary Mead, where everyone knew everyone's business, a secret could not stay hidden for long, and Miss Marple, with her quiet ways and sharp mind, was determined to uncover it. What did you think of this mystery? Where are you listening this story from? Perhaps a cozy village like St. Mary Mead, or somewhere far more bustling. Drop your location in the comments below and let us know what you think the glove might mean. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for the next chapter of this gripping mystery. We'll unravel the secrets of St. Mary Mead together. Chapter 2. The Glove in Question. The vicarage garden in St. Mary Mead was a place of quiet beauty, its rose beds meticulously tended by Mrs. Clement, who found solace in pruning and planting when parish duties grew overwhelming. The gravel path leading to the gate, however, was less pristine, often littered with leaves or the occasional twig blown down by an autumn gust. It was here, just beyond the gnarled oak that marked the boundary of the vicarage grounds, that the glove with 2 fingers had been found, and by mid-afternoon the news had spread like wildfire through the village. Miss Jane Marple, her basket of knitting tucked under her arm, decided to take her customary afternoon stroll past the vicarage. She told herself it was merely to admire Mrs. Clement's roses. But her sharp eyes scanned the path as she walked, noting the scuffed gravel and the patch of grass where Mrs. Murgatroyd had found the glove. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and late-blooming lavender, and the village was unusually busy for a Tuesday. Knots of neighbours lingered near the churchyard, their voices low but animated, and Miss Marple caught fragments of their chatter as she passed. Never seen anything like it, not in all my years. Must belong to someone passing through, surely. But why leave it there, of all places? She paused by the vicarage gate, ostensibly to adjust her scarf, but in truth to listen. Mrs. Price, the butcher's wife, stood with Mrs. Bantry from Gossington Hall, their heads bent close together. Mrs. Bantry, a woman of robust opinions and a flair for the dramatic, was gesturing animatedly. "It sets positively Gothic, Mrs. Price," she was saying. "A glove with 2 fingers. It sets like something out of one of those dreadful novels my Arthur reads. I told him it sets a sign of something wicked, mark my words." Mrs. Price, more practical, but no less intrigued, shook her head. "I don't know about wicked, Mrs. Bantry, but it's stats odd, that's stats for certain. My Tom says it might be a workman's glove for handling tools or some such. But why only 2 fingers? And why leave it by the vicarage?" Miss Marple approached, her step light and her smile disarming. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Bantry, Mrs. Price," she said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "I see the glove is still the talk of the village. Have you seen it yourselves?" Mrs. Bantry turned, her eyes alight with excitement. "Oh, Miss Marple, not yet. But Clara, Mrs. Clement, that is, says it sits at the vicarage now. She sits keeping it safe until someone claims it. Though who would claim such a thing? I can imagine. It is curious." Miss Marple agreed, her tone mild, but her mind alert. "I saw it at the post office this morning. Fine leather, very well made. Not the sort of thing one misplaces carelessly." Mrs. Price nodded. "That's what I said to Tom. That's not cheap, that glove. Someone meant to leave it, or they have come looking by now. But what I want to know is, what sits it for? Nobody in St. Mary Mead has a hand like that, unless they lost fingers, and I know if they had." Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. People do have their secrets, Mrs. Price, though I dare say a glove like that might not be for a hand at all. It could be for something else entirely, machinery perhaps, or a task we haven't set thought of. Mrs. Bantry Stitt's eyes widened.
Machinery?
Oh,
Miss Marple, you do have the most intriguing ideas.
do you think it's something mechanical then? Like one of those new-fangled gadgets they always talking about in the papers? Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her tone non-committal. Or perhaps it's simpler than that. In my experience, the strangest things often have the most ordinary explanations once you see them clearly. Their conversation was interrupted by the creak of the vicarage gate. The Reverend Leonard Clement emerged, his usually cheerful face clouded with unease. He was a slight man, with a scholarly air, and a habit of blinking rapidly when flustered, which he was now. "Good afternoon, ladies," he said, tipping his hat. "I see you're discussing our little mystery." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed, Vicar. Mrs. Murgatroyd mentioned you taken charge of the glove. Have there been any developments?" The vicar hesitated, glancing toward the church, as if expecting answers to materialize from its ancient stones. "None, I'm afraid. I've put it in my study for safekeeping, but I confess it troubles me. It's such an odd thing, and its appearance has stirred up the parish. People are saying all sorts of nonsense, ghosts, curses, you know how they talk." Mrs. Bantry gave a theatrical shudder. "Ghosts? I told Arthur, it's got a sinister air about it." "Donest? You think so, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I think, Mrs. Bantry, that people are often more sinister than gloves, but I would very much like to see where it was found, Vicar, if you don't mind. Sometimes the place itself tells a story." The vicar brightened at this practical suggestion. "Of course, Miss Marple. It's just here by the oak." He led the way down the gravel path, pointing to a spot where the grass was slightly flattened. "Mrs. Murgatroyd found it early this morning, half buried in the grass. I looked myself, but saw nothing else. No footprints, no other items." Miss Marple bent down, her movements slow but deliberate, and examined the ground. The grass was indeed disturbed, but not trampled, as if someone had taken care to step lightly. A few blades were bent, and there was a faint indentation in the soil, barely noticeable. She straightened, her expression thoughtful. "It's a curious place to lose a glove," she said. "So close to the vicarage, yet not on the main path, almost as if it were meant to be found." The vicar blinked. "Meant to be found? But why?" "Oh, I don't know," Miss Marple said airily, though her mind was anything but idle. "People do strange things, don't they? Sometimes they leave things behind to send a message, or to distract from something else." Mrs. Price frowned. A message? What kind of message could a glove send? And to whom? Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she turned to the vicar. "Have you noticed anyone unusual near the vicarage lately, Mr. Clement? Perhaps someone passing through, or lingering where they shouldn't sect?" The vicar rubbed his chin, his brow furrowing. "Well, now that you mention it, I did see that new fellow Mr. Hawthorne walking by yesterday evening. He was coming from the direction of the Miller cottage, but he didn't stop, just nodded, and kept on. I thought nothing of it at the time." "Mr. Hawthorne," Mrs. Bantry said, her voice dripping with suspicion. "There sits something about that man, I tell you, always in that long coat, even in this weather. And those eyes, sharp, like he sits, watching everything." Miss Marple's smile was placid, but her mind was racing. She had seen Mr. Hawthorne herself that morning, his left hand gloved as he walked toward the vicarage. Could the glove belong to him? And if so, why leave it here? Or was it, as she suspected, not about the glove itself, but what it represented? As they walked back toward the vicarage, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the oak tree, its gnarled branches casting long shadows across the path. She thought of a case her nephew Raymond had once mentioned about a stolen painting hidden in plain sight, its theft disguised by a seemingly unrelated clue. This glove, she felt certain, was such a clue, a thread in a tapestry she had yet to unravel. "I think," she said, almost to herself, "that I shall have to invite Mr. Hawthorne for tea. That's the neighbourly thing to do. Done. Set you think." Mrs. Bantry clapped her hands. "Oh, Miss Marple, you set'll marvel. You set'll get to the bottom of this. I know it, but do be careful. That glove gives me the shivers." Miss Marple only smiled. Shivers, she knew, were often the first sign of truth coming to light. And in St. Mary Mead, truth had a way of revealing itself to those who watched closely. Chapter 3. The newcomer sits. Arrival. The Miller cottage, perched at the edge of St. Mary Mead, was a quaint, ivy-clad dwelling that had stood empty for nearly a year since old Mrs. Miller's passing. Its new occupant, Mr. Cedric Hawthorne, had arrived quietly a week ago, his belongings delivered in a single, unassuming van that rattled down the lane under cover of dusk. The village, ever alert to newcomers, had taken note, but Mr. Hawthorne's reserved demeanour and preference for solitude had left them with little to go on beyond speculation. By the time the glove with 2 fingers appeared, his name was already on every tongue, and the whispers grew sharper. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her garden with a cup of tea and her knitting, had a clear view of the lane leading to the Miller cottage. She had seen Mr. Hawthorne twice now, once striding toward the vicarage, his long coat flapping like a raven's wings, and once pausing by the village shop, his sharp eyes scanning the street as if searching for something. He was tall, with a lean frame and a face that might have been handsome if not for its guarded expression. His hair, dark with streaks of silver, was neatly combed, and his hands, always gloved, she noted, moved with a precision that suggested discipline, perhaps even secrecy. This morning, as the village buzzed with talk of the glove, Miss Marple decided it was time to learn more about the mysterious antiquarian. She had sent a note to the Miller cottage, inviting Mr. Hawthorne for tea at 4 o'clock, couched in the polite neighbourly terms that no one in St. Mary Mead could refuse without raising eyebrows. As she waited, she arranged her best china on the lace-covered table in her sitting room, the delicate clink of cups a soothing counterpoint to the questions swirling in her mind. At precisely 4, a sharp knock announced Mr. Hawthorne's arrival. Miss Marple opened the door to find him standing on her doorstep, his coat buttoned despite the mild weather, a faint smile on his lips that did not quite reach his eyes. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low and measured, with a trace of an accent she couldn't place. "It's kind of you to invite me. I'm not much accustomed to village life, I'm afraid." "Nonsense, Mr. Hawthorne," she replied, her smile warm but her eyes keen. "St. Mary Mead has a way of making everyone feel at home. Do come in and have some tea." She led him to the sitting room, where sunlight streamed through the windows, casting patterns on the polished floor. As he settled into an armchair, Miss Marple noted the way he crossed his legs, the left hand, gloved in plain black leather, resting lightly on his knee. The glove, she observed, was ordinary, with spaces for all 5 fingers. Did that rule him out as the owner of the 2-fingered glove, or was it simply a different pair? "I understand you sit an antiquarian," she began, pouring tea with a steady hand. "It must be fascinating work. Old books, perhaps? Or artifacts?" Mr. Hawthorne accepted the cup, his fingers brushing the saucer with care. "A bit of both," he said. "I specialize in rare manuscripts and curiosities, items with stories behind them. I travel a good deal, but St. Mary Mead seemed a quiet place to catalogue some recent acquisitions." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest, though she was already cataloguing his words in her own way. "How delightful! We don't often get such scholarly visitors. Though I dare say you heard about our little mystery, the glove found by the vicarage." His smile flickered, so briefly she might have missed it if she hadn't been watching. "I heard whispers," he said, sipping his tea. "A glove with 2 fingers, is it? Sounds like something from a medieval archive, a relic of some obscure trade, perhaps." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone light, "though it's odd, don't you think, that it should appear so suddenly and in such a prominent place? One might almost think it was left deliberately." Mr. Hawthorne's eyes met hers, and for a moment she felt the weight of his scrutiny. "People are careless," he said, his voice smooth. "They drop things without thinking. Or perhaps it was a prank. Villages have their share of mischief, I am told." "Oh, indeed," Miss Marple agreed, her needles clicking softly as she picked up her knitting. "Though I find mischief often has a purpose, even if it's not immediately clear. In my experience, Mr. Hawthorne, the smallest things, a glove, a letter, a glance, can reveal so much about a person's intentions." He leaned back, his expression unreadable. "You have a sharp mind, Miss Marple. I imagine little escapes you." She smiled, her eyes crinkling with a warmth that belied their sharpness. "Oh, I'm just an old woman who likes to watch and listen. People are so interesting. Don't you find? The way they move, the things they choose not to say." The conversation turned to village matters, the church fete, the new postman's habit of mixing up letters, but Miss Marple steered it gently, probing without seeming to. She learned that Mr. Hawthorne had come from London, though he was vague about his recent travels. He spoke of a collection of manuscripts he was studying, locked away in his study at the Miller cottage, but offered no details. When she mentioned the vicarage path, he remarked casually that he often walked that way in the evenings, finding the quiet conducive to thought. As he spoke, Miss Marple's mind turned to the glove. Could it be one of his curiosities, misplaced during one of his walks? Or was it, as she suspected, something more, a marker, a signal, a piece of a puzzle she had yet to assemble? She thought of a story her friend Sir Henry Clithering had once told her about a coded message hidden in a seemingly innocent object. The glove, with its peculiar design, felt like such an object. The clock struck 5, and Mr. Hawthorne rose, thanking her for the tea. "You been most welcoming, Miss Marple," he said, his tone courteous but distant. "I hope I still be invited again." "Of course," she replied, her smile as gracious as ever. "And do be careful on your walks, Mr. Hawthorne. St. Mary Mead is quiet, but even quiet places have their surprises." As he left, she watched him from the window, noting the measured pace of his stride, the way his gloved hand swung at his side. She returned to her knitting, her thoughts weaving a pattern as intricate as the wool in her hands. Hawthorne was hiding something. She was certain, not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't. His reticence, his careful choice of words, reminded her of young Dr. Haydock's assistant years ago, who had turned out to be concealing a rather unsavoury past. That evening, as she sat by her fire, Miss Marple reflected on the glove. Its fine leather suggested wealth or care, yet its design spoke of purpose, something specific, deliberate. She recalled Mrs. Murgatroyd's description of where it was found, half hidden in the grass, as if placed with intent. And now Mr. Hawthorne, with his guarded manner and evening walks, had entered the picture. Was he connected, or was he merely a convenient target for village suspicion? She resolved to visit the vicarage again tomorrow, to speak with Mrs. Clement, and perhaps examine the glove once more. In St. Mary Mead, secrets had a way of surfacing, like bubbles in a still pond, and Miss Marple, with her quiet ways and unerring instinct, was determined to stir the waters until they did. Chapter 4. Tea and Suspicions. The sitting-room of Miss Jane Marple's cottage was a haven of warmth and order, its chintz curtains drawn back to let in the soft afternoon light. The table was set with her best Wedgwood china, a silver teapot gleaming at its centre, and a plate of scones, freshly baked by her maid, Florence, emitting a faint buttery aroma. Miss Marple had invited a small, carefully chosen group for tea: Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Bentry from Gossington Hall, and Mrs. Elspeth Gray, a sharp-tongued widow who lived near the church and missed nothing that happened in St. Mary Mead. The ostensible purpose was to discuss the upcoming church fete, but Miss Marple had another aim: to sift through the village gossip and uncover what, if anything, connected the mysterious glove to Mr. Cedric Hawthorne or anyone else. As the ladies settled into their chairs, their chatter filled the room like the hum of bees. To Mrs. Clement, her hands fluttering nervously, was recounting the latest parish news, while Mrs. Bantry, ever theatrical, gestured broadly as she described a recent article about a London theft. Gray, her grey eyes glinting with a hint of mischief, listened in silence, her teacup balanced delicately in her hand. Miss Marple poured the tea with her usual grace, her movements slow and deliberate, but her ears attuned to every word. "Such a pleasant afternoon for a gathering," she said, her voice gentle but carrying that quiet authority that drew attention. "Though I must say, the village seems rather preoccupied with that curious glove. Have any of you heard anything new?" Mrs. Clement 6. Hands fluttered to her throat. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's 6, all anyone talks about. Leonard, my husband, that is, says it's 6, still in his study, locked in a drawer. No one 6 claimed it, and I can sict help feeling it's 6. Well, not quite right." "Not right." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her eyes wide. "Clura, you make it sound positively sinister. I told Arthur it sits like something from one of his detective novels. A glove with 2 fingers. Why, it sits practically a cipher." Mrs. Gray gave a short, dry laugh. "Nonsense, Dolly. It's probably some tradesman's sits tool, dropped by accident, though I will say it's odd that it appeared so soon after that Mr. Hawthorne arrived. He sits a queer one, isn't he? Always skulking about in that coat, like he sits hiding something." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she knitted, her expression one of mild interest. "Mr. Hawthorne does seem to keep to himself," she said, "though he was kind enough to come for tea yesterday. He mentioned he's an antiquarian, studying manuscripts. I wonder if the glove could be one of his curiosities, something from his collection perhaps." Mrs. Graysip's eyebrows rose. An antiquarian. That Sip's what he says, but I saw him coming out of the woods near the vicarage 2 nights ago, well past 9. What's Sip's an antiquarian doing wandering in the dark, and with those gloves he always wears? Makes you wonder if one of them has 2 fingers. Mrs. Clement gasped. Elspeth, you don't think he sits involved, do you? He seems so gentlemanly, in his way. Gentlemanly. Mrs. Bantry scoffed. Clara, you're too kind. There's something about that man that gives me the creeps. Those eyes of his, always watching, like a hawk. And why rent the Miller cottage, if he's only here for a short stay? It's not as if St. Mary Mead is a hub of antiquarian treasures. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes crinkling with a faint smile. People do have their reasons for coming to a quiet village, she said. Though I must say, Mrs. Gray, your observation about the woods is interesting. The vicarage path isn't far from there, is it? Perhaps Mr. Hawthorne was simply taking an evening walk. Mrs. Gray snorted. At 9 o'clock? In the dark? Hardly. I was coming back from visiting Mrs. Price, and there he was, slipping out of the trees like a shadow. Didn't see me. Mind you, I was behind the hedge, but he looked furtive, if you ask me. Miss Marple's needles paused, just for a moment. Furtive was a word she stored away, like a piece of yarn tucked into her basket. She thought of her nephew Raymond's stories about men who moved silently in the night, their actions betraying secrets they thought well hidden. It's curious, isn't it? She said, her tone light, how a small thing like a glove can stir up so much talk. I wonder if anyone else has been seen near the vicarage lately, someone we haven't thought of. Mrs. Clement frowned, her fingers twisting the edge of her napkin. Well, there sits young Tommy Pierce, always cycling about, and Mrs. Price mentioned seeing that new postman, what sits his name, Mr. Finch, near the church last week, but surely they wouldn't have anything to do with it. Tommy Pierce is a scamp, Mrs. Bantry said, reaching for a scone, always up to mischief. But a glove like that? It's too sophisticated for a boy, Stit's prank. And Mr. Finch seems harmless enough, though he did deliver my letters to the wrong house twice this week. Mrs. Gray leaned forward, her voice low. If you ask me, it's not the glove itself, but what it means. In my day, people left things like that as a sign, a warning. Even my late husband, God rest him, used to tell me about smugglers who'd leave markers to signal a drop. Could be something like that. Miss Marple Sip's eyes twinkled. A warning? How intriguing, Mrs. Gray. Though I dare say smugglers are a bit dramatic for St. Mary Mead, still, it does make one wonder what someone might want to signal, and to whom. The conversation drifted to the church feet, with Mrs. Clement fretting over the cake stall, and Mrs. Bantry insisting on a fortune-telling booth to liven things up. But Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, piecing together the fragments she'd gathered. Mrs. Gray's sighting of Mr. Hawthorne in the woods was significant, not because it proved anything, but because it suggested he was not quite the solitary scholar he claimed to be. And the glove, with its deliberate design, felt less like an accident, and more like a piece of a larger puzzle. As she refilled the teapot, she steered the talk back to the glove. Mrs. Clement, you said the glove is in the Vicar Setter's study. Has anyone else seen it since it was found, or perhaps asked about it? Mrs. Clement shook her head. No one, Miss Marple. Leonard's kept it locked away, though he did show it to Mr. Dane Calthrop, you know, the curate, yesterday. Mr. Calthrop thought it might be a theatrical prop left by someone passing through, but I can't imagine who'd be performing plays in St. Mary Mead. A theatrical prop, Miss Marple murmured, her needles clicking again. That's an interesting idea, although it would have to be a very specific kind of play, wouldn't it? One with a character who needed such a glove. Mrs. Bantry clapped her hands. A villain, perhaps? Oh, Miss Marple, you sit making it sound like one of Arthur Sip's stories. A masked figure, leaving clues to taunt the village. Miss Marple smiled, but her mind was turning over darker possibilities. She thought of a case Sir Henry Clithering had once shared, about a man who used a peculiar object, a carved walking stick, to distract from his true intentions. Could the glove be such a distraction, or was it, as Mrs. Gray suggested, a signal meant for someone specific? As the ladies rose to leave, Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Mrs. Gray, who had been unusually quiet for the last few minutes. There was a sharpness to her, a watchfulness that Miss Marple recognized from her own observations. Mrs. Gray, she suspected, knew more than she was saying, perhaps not about the glove itself, but about the undercurrents in the village. "Thank you. For a lovely afternoon," Mrs. Clement said, adjusting her hat. "Though I do hope this glove business is sorted soon. It's serpents making Leonard terribly anxious." Mrs. Bantry laughed. "Anxious? Clara, it's the most exciting thing to happen in St. Mary Mead since that business with the poisoned jam. Don't you worry. Miss Marple will get to the bottom of it." Miss Marple only smiled, her hands busy with her knitting. As the ladies left, she stood by the window, watching them disappear down the lane. The glove, Mr. Hawthorne, Mrs. Gray's furtive sighting, all were threads in a tapestry she was beginning to see, though the pattern was still unclear. She resolved to visit the vicar tomorrow, to see the glove again, and ask a few discreet questions. In St. Mary Mead, the truth was often hidden in plain sight, and Miss Marple had a knack for spotting it. Chapter 5. The Locked Study. The morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead like a gossamer veil, softening the outlines of the cottages and muffling the clop of the milkman's horse. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a shawl against the early chill, was pruning her roses when the news reached her. Young Tommy Pierce, his bicycle wobbling under the weight of his excitement, skidded to a halt outside her gate. "Miss Marple," he called, his voice carrying across the quiet lane. "There's been a break-in at the Miller cottage. Mr. Hawthorne's place. Mrs. Price saw the constable there this morning." Miss Marple, 6 pruning shears, paused mid-snip, her eyes bright with interest behind her spectacles. "A break-in, Tommy?" she said, her tone calm but encouraging. "That Sip's quite serious. Did Mrs. Price say what happened?" Tommy, eager to share his scoop, leaned over the gate. "She says someone smashed a window last night, got into the cottage, but didn't take nothing far as anyone knows." Mr. Hawthorne was proper upset though, shouting at the constable, saying his work's been meddled with. "Everyone's talking about it." "Thank you, Tommy," Miss Marple said, slipping a penny into his hand. "Do be careful on that bicycle. You're wobbling more than usual." As he pedalled off, she returned her shears to their basket, her mind already turning. A break-in, but nothing stolen. That was unusual, even in a village as quiet as St. Mary Mead, and at Mr. Hawthorne's cottage no less, where the mysterious antiquarian kept his locked study. She thought of the glove with 2 fingers, still unclaimed in the vicar's drawer, and wondered if the 2 events were threads of the same tapestry. By noon, the village was abuzz. Miss Marple, deciding a visit to the vicarage could wait, made her way to the high street, where knots of neighbours gathered, their voices a mix of concern and barely concealed delight at the drama. She found Mrs. Price outside the butcher's shop, her apron dusted with flour and her eyes gleaming with gossip. "Oh, Miss Marple!" Mrs. Price exclaimed, wiping her hands. "It's dreadful, isn't it? Poor Mr. Hawthorne, though I can't say I'm surprised, him being so secretive. My Tom heard the commotion this morning, went to have a look, and there was the constable poking about the cottage, a window in the back, smashed to bits." Miss Marple Sitz's expression was one of gentle concern. "How alarming," she said. "Was Mr. Hawthorne at home when it happened?" "That's the thing," Mrs. Price said, lowering her voice. "He says he was out. Another of his evening walks, if you please. Came back late, and didn't notice the window till morning. But here's the queer part. Tom says the constable found no footprints, no marks, nothing to show how the intruder got in or out. And Mr. Hawthorne swears nothing's missing, though he was in a right state about his study." "His study?" Miss Marple Sitz's needles, tucked into her basket, seemed to quiver with her interest. "Was that where the intruder went?" Mrs. Price nodded vigorously. "So Tom says, the window's just outside the study door, and Mr. Hawthorne keeps it locked tighter than a bank vault. The constable wanted to look inside, but Mr. Hawthorne wouldn't have it, said it's private, full of valuable papers. What kind of papers need that much secrecy, I ask you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "An antiquarian set's work can be quite delicate, I suppose. Old manuscripts, rare documents, they sit often worth a great deal, though it is odd that nothing was taken." "Odd's the word," Mrs. Price said. "My Tom thinks it's such that glove business all over again, someone stirring up trouble. And you know what they sat saying, Mr. Hawthorne sets mixed up in it somehow. Why else would someone break into his place?" Miss Marple did not reply, but her mind was busy. A break-in with nothing stolen suggested either an interrupted thief or something more deliberate, a search perhaps for something specific. She thought of Mr. Hawthorne's guarded manner during their tea, his vague answers about his work, and the glove, found so near the vicarage, not far from the path to the Miller cottage. Could the two incidents be linked, or was the village's imagination running away with it? Determined to learn more, she made her way to the Miller cottage, ostensibly to offer her sympathies. The cottage stood at the end of a narrow lane, its ivy-clad walls giving it an air of seclusion. As she approached, she saw Constable Hurst, a young man with an earnest face and a tendency to take notes too seriously, speaking to Mr. Hawthorne outside the front door. The antiquarian's expression was taut, his gloved hands clenched at his sides. "Good afternoon, Constable Mr. Hawthorne," Miss Marple said, her voice as mild as ever. "I heard about the trouble and thought I'd see if all was well." Mr. Hawthorne Sitz's eyes flicked to her, and for a moment she caught a flash of irritation before his face smoothed into politeness. "In Miss Marple," he said, nodding. "Kind of you to come. That's nothing serious, I assure you, just a bit of vandalism, probably some local lads." Constable Hurst cleared his throat. "No sign of lads, sir. The window sips smashed clean through, but the ground sips dry, no footprints, no marks, and you say nothing. Sips gone." "Nothing," Mr. Hawthorne said firmly. "I step-checked my study thoroughly. Everything Zepp's in order." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the cottage, noting the small broken window near the back. It was low to the ground, easily accessible, but the surrounding earth looked undisturbed. "How curious," she said. "A broken window, but no trace of the intruder. Perhaps they were frightened off before they could take anything." Perhaps, Mr. Hawthorne said, his tone clipped. Though I sit rather not have the village poking about, my work requires privacy. Of course, Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. Though I wonder, Mr. Hawthorne, if you sid seen that odd glove everyone sid's talking about, the one with 2 fingers, found by the vicarage. It sid such a peculiar thing, almost like something from one of your collections. His eyes narrowed slightly, but his voice remained steady. I step heard of it. Yes, sounds like a curiosity, but not one of mine. My interests lie in manuscripts, not gloves. Constable Hurst, sensing an opportunity, jumped in. Speaking of that glove, sir, you were seen near the vicarage a few nights ago. Just routine, you understand, but have you noticed anything unusual on your walks? Mr. Hawthorne's jaw tightened. I walk to clear my head, Constable. I don't skulk about noticing things. If you'll excuse me, I have work to do. With a curt nod, he turned and disappeared into the cottage, the door closing firmly behind him. Constable Hurst sighed, scribbling in his notebook. He sits not the easiest fellow, is he?
Miss Marple.
One sit, let me near that study. Says it sits full of papers, valuable ones, mind you, but I can sit help thinking there sits more to it. Miss Marple sit's expression was thoughtful. People do value their privacy, Constable, though it does make one wonder what sits so valuable that it needs a locked door. Perhaps you might ask Mrs. Gray if she sits seen anyone else near the cottage. She sits very observant, you know. As she walked back to her cottage, Miss Marple's mind was a whirl of possibilities. The break-in, like the glove, felt staged, too neat, too deliberate. She thought of a case her friend Sir Henry Clithering had once described, where a burglary was faked to cover a more subtle crime. Could this be similar? And Mr. Hawthorne's study, with its locked door and cryptic papers, what secrets did it hold? She resolved to speak to Mrs. Gray, who had seen Mr. Hawthorne in the woods, and to revisit the vicarage to examine the glove again. In St. Mary Mead, the smallest details often held the key to the truth, and Miss Marple was determined to find it, one thread at a time. Chapter 6. The Vicar Set's Tale. The vicarage in St. Mary Mead was a rambling old house, its stone walls weathered by time, and its windows framed by climbing roses that Mrs. Clement tended with devotion. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and lavender, a comforting contrast to the unease that had settled over the village since the discovery of the glove with 2 fingers and the break-in at Mr. Hawthorne's cottage. Miss Jane Marple, her basket of knitting tucked under her arm, made her way to the vicarage under the pretense of discussing the church fete, though her true purpose was to speak with the Reverend Leonard Clement about the glove and any other matters that might shed light on the village's growing mystery. She found the vicar in his study, a cosy room lined with bookshelves and cluttered with papers, his desk illuminated by a single lamp that cast long shadows across the floor. The glove, still unclaimed, sat in a small wooden box on a side table, its black leather gleaming faintly in the dim light. Mr. Clement looked up as she entered, his scholarly face marked by a weariness that suggested more than just parish duties weighed on him. "Miss Marple," he said, rising with a tired smile. "How good of you to come. I sim afraid I sit's a bit distracted. This glove business has everyone in a tizzy, and now the break-in at Mr. Hawthorne sit's cottage. It sits all rather unsettling." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting needles clicking softly as she began to work. "It is unusual," she agreed, her tone gentle but her eyes sharp. "I thought I might take another look at the glove, if you don't mind. And perhaps you've heard something new. People do confide in you, don't they? The vicar hesitated, his fingers tapping nervously on the desk. "They do," he said slowly. "Though I confess, I sit's reluctant to add to the gossip. But since it sits you, Miss Marple, I sits tell you something that sits been troubling me. It sits about Mr. Hawthorne and Mrs. Gray." Miss Marple sits Needles paused, just for a moment. "Mrs. Gray," she said, her voice carrying a note of mild surprise. Do go on, Mr. Clement, you know I sit 'em discreet." He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It was 2 evenings ago, just before the break-in. I was in the churchyard, tending to some papers for the fete, when I heard raised voices near the vicarage gate. It was dark, but I recognized Mr. Hawthorne's voice, sharp, almost angry. Gray was with him, speaking just as fiercely. I couldn't catch all of it, but I heard her say something about keeping promises and not being fooled. He told her to leave it alone, or she'd regret it." Miss Marple Sit's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained placid. "How extraordinary," she said. "And you sit certain it was Mrs. Gray?" "Oh yes," the vicar said, nodding. "Her voice is unmistakable, so crisp, like she's cutting through the air. I didn't want to eavesdrop, so I moved away, but it stayed with me. And then the next night, the break-in at Mr. Hawthorne's cottage. It's hard not to wonder if there's a connection." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, the soft click a counterpoint to her racing thoughts. Mrs. Elspeth Gray, with her sharp eyes and sharper tongue, had already caught her attention at the tea party, particularly her mention of seeing Mr. Hawthorne in the woods. Now, a confrontation? It suggested a deeper entanglement, one that might tie to the glove or the break-in or both. "Did you see anything else that night?" she asked, her tone light. "Anyone else near the vicarage, perhaps?" The vicar frowned, rubbing his chin. "Not that I recall, though now that you mention it, I did see young Tommy Pierce cycling past, earlier that evening, just before dusk. He was going awfully fast, as if he were in a hurry. But that sit's not unusual for him." Miss Marple nodded, filing the detail away. Tommy Pierce, always rushing about, might have seen something without realizing its importance. "And the glove," she said, glancing at the box on the table. "May I?" "Of course," the vicar said, retrieving the box and opening it. The glove lay inside, its 2-fingered design as peculiar as ever, the leather smooth and unblemished, except for a faint crease near the thumb. Miss Marple examined it closely, noting the fine stitching and the absence of any maker's mark. It was, she thought, almost too perfect, as if crafted for a specific purpose rather than everyday use. "It sets such an odd thing," Mr. Clement said, watching her. Mr. Dane Calthrop, the curate, thought it might be a theatrical prop, but I can imagine what kind of play would need it. And with the break-in, I sep starting to wonder if it sets, well, something more sinister." Miss Marple, Stella's lips curved into a faint smile. "Sinister is a strong word, vicar. Though I will say, it's Stella's not the glove itself that interests me so much as why it was left where it was, near the vicarage gate, half hidden. It feels deliberate. Done set you think." The vicar blinked, his scholarly mind grappling with the idea. "Deliberate? You mean someone wanted it to be found?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone airy but her mind sharp. "Or perhaps it was meant to distract us from something else. In my experience, Mr. Clement, people leave things behind for all sorts of reasons, to send a message, to cover a trail, or simply because they're careless. The trick is knowing which." She returned the glove to its box, her thoughts turning to Mrs. Gray and Mr. Hawthorne, A confrontation near the vicarage, just before a break-in at his cottage, coincidence or something more? She recalled a case her nephew Raymond had once mentioned about a staged argument used to divert suspicion from a larger scheme. Could Mrs. Gray, with her watchful eyes, be part of such a scheme? Or was she, like the vicar, merely caught in the web of someone else's making? As she rose to leave, Miss Marple paused by the study window, her gaze drifting to the vicarage garden. The oak tree by the gate stood sentinel, its branches casting dappled shadows on the path where the glove had been found. She thought of Mrs. Gray's sighting of Mr. Hawthorne in the woods, and now the vicar's tale of their heated exchange. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though it was still blurred, like a tapestry seen from too far away. "Thank you, Mr. Clement," she said, adjusting her shawl. "You've been most helpful. And do let me know if anyone comes for the glove, or if you hear anything more about Mr. Hawthorne or Mrs. Gray." The vicar nodded, his expression troubled. "I will, Miss Marple, though I hope this all turns out to be nothing more than village nerves. I hate to think there sits real trouble in St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple smiled, but her eyes were serious. "Trouble, vicar, has a way of finding even the quietest places, but it also has a way of being found out, if one knows where to look." As she walked back to her cottage, the mist had lifted, revealing the village in sharp relief. She passed Mrs. Gray's house, its curtains drawn tight, and noted the absence of any sign of life. Mr. Hawthorne's cottage, too, was silent as she passed, its broken window now boarded up. The glove, the break-in, the confrontation, all were threads in a mystery that was growing more intricate by the day. Miss Marple's mind, as sharp as her knitting needles, was already weaving them together, searching for the truth hidden in the quiet corners of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 7. A Shadow in the Lane. The moon hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting a silver glow across the village that turned the familiar lanes into a maze of shadows. Miss Jane Marple, unable to sleep, sat by her bedroom window with a cup of chamomile tea, her knitting idle in her lap. Insomnia was rare for her, but the events of the past few days, the glove with 2 fingers, the break-in at Mr. Hawthorne's cottage, and the vicar's troubling tale of a confrontation between Mr. Hawthorne and Mrs. Gray, had set her mind spinning. She often found that the quiet of night brought clarity, and so she watched the village, her sharp eyes scanning the darkness for anything out of place. It was just past 11 when she saw it, a flicker of movement near the vicarage gate, where the glove had been found. At first she thought it might be a fox or a stray cat, common enough in the village at this hour. But as she leaned closer to the window, her spectacles catching the moonlight, she saw the unmistakable outline of a figure, tall, cloaked in a dark coat, moving with a stealth that suggested purpose. The figure paused by the oak tree, its branches swaying gently in the night breeze, and seemed to peer toward the vicarage before slipping into the shadows of the lane. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained calm. She set her tea aside and reached for her shawl, her movement swift but silent. Slipping on her sturdy shoes, she crept downstairs and out the back door, careful to avoid the creaky floorboard in the hall. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of damp grass and late roses, and she moved quietly along the hedge that bordered her garden, keeping to the shadows herself. The lane was deserted by the time she reached it, but her eyes, accustomed to the dark, caught a faint disturbance in the gravel near the vicarage gate, a scuff mark, barely visible, as if someone had taken care to tread lightly. She crouched, her fingers brushing the ground, and noted a small crumpled leaf caught in the gravel, its edges torn as if stepped on. It was a trifling thing, but Miss Marple knew that trifles often held the key to greater truths. She straightened, her gaze fixed on the vicarage. The house was dark, its windows shuttered, but the gate creaked slightly in the wind, as if inviting scrutiny. She thought of the glove found in this very spot, and the vicar's story of Mr. Hawthorne's argument with Mrs. Gray. Could the figure she'd seen be Mr. Hawthorne, returning to the scene for some reason, or Mrs. Gray, whose sharp eyes and sharper words suggested she knew more than she let on? Or was it someone else entirely, drawn to the vicarage by a purpose she had yet to uncover? As she stood there, a soft rustle came from the direction of the churchyard, and she froze, her breath catching. The sound was faint, like the brush of fabric against stone, and she turned her head slowly, her eyes scanning the darkness. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of movement near the church wall, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. She waited, her heart steady now, her mind as sharp as the moonlight. Whoever it was, they were gone. Or so they thought. Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her steps measured, but her thoughts racing. She lit a candle and settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed as a way to steady her hands while her mind worked. The figure in the lane was no phantom. It was someone real, someone with a reason to be near the vicarage at such an hour. She thought of a case her friend Sir Henry Clithering had once shared about a thief who returned to the scene of a crime to retrieve a forgotten clue. Could the glove be such a clue, left behind and now sought after? Or was it, as she increasingly suspected, a deliberate plant meant to draw attention to the vicarage for reasons yet unknown? The next morning, she made her way to the village shop, where the gossip was as fresh as the bread on the counter. Mrs. Price, ever eager to share, was holding court with a small crowd, including young Tommy Pierce, who was munching on a toffee. And I heard it from Mrs. Bantry herself. Mrs. Price was saying she saw a light in the vicarage garden last night, flickering like a will-o'-the-wisp. If you ask me, it's connected to that glove. Someone's up to no good. Miss Marple, selecting a tin of biscuits, joined the conversation with her usual diffidence. A light, Mrs. Price. How curious. I was up late myself, and thought I saw something near the vicarage gate. A shadow, perhaps. Did Mrs. Bantry say anything else? Mrs. Price's eyes widened. A shadow. Oh, Miss Marple, you're giving me chills. Mrs. Bantry said it was gone by the time she looked again, but she swears it wasn't a lantern, more like a match or a cigarette, flaring up and then out. She told Arthur it's all to do with Mr. Hawthorne, mark my words. Tommy Pierce, his mouth full of toffee, piped up. I saw something too, Miss Marple. Last night, when I was taking a shortcut through the churchyard, someone was by the vicarage, moving all sneaky-like. Couldn't see who, though. It was too dark. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her mind was alert. Thank you, Tommy. You sit very observant. Did you notice anything else, perhaps what they were wearing, or which way they went? Tommy frowned, chewing thoughtfully. Dunno, Miss Marple. They had a long coat, I think, and they went toward the lane by Mrs. Gray Sip's house. Didn't see no face, though. Mrs. Price clucked her tongue. A long coat? That sounds like Mr. Hawthorne, doesn't it? Always in that coat of his, even in summer. I bet he sits mixed up in this, glove or no glove. Miss Marple did not reply, but her thoughts were busy. A long coat was hardly unique. Half the village wore them in the evening chill, but the direction toward Mrs. Gray's house was interesting. She recalled the vicar's tale of the confrontation between Mrs. Gray and Mr. Hawthorne, and Mrs. Gray's own mention of seeing him in the woods. Now, a figure lurking near the vicarage, moving toward her house. The threads were beginning to intertwine, though the pattern remained elusive. She decided to pay a visit to Mrs. Gray that afternoon, under the guise of borrowing a recipe for the church fete. Mrs. Gray's house, a neat cottage with a privet hedge, was quiet when Miss Marple arrived, but the curtains twitched as she approached, a sign that her visit was anticipated. Gray answered the door herself, her grey eyes sharp and her smile thin. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice crisp. "What a surprise! Come for a recipe. Have you, or is it something else?" Miss Marple's smile was disarming. "A recipe, of course, Mrs. Gray, though I confess the village is so full of talk about that glove and the break-in, I can't help being curious. Have you heard anything new?" Mrs. Gray's lips tightened, but she invited Miss Marple inside, where they sat in a parlour as tidy as its owner. "I've heard plenty," she said, pouring tea with a steady hand. "All nonsense, if you ask me. People are saying Mr. Hawthorne's a thief or worse, but I say it's just village hysteria. That glove's probably nothing, a prank or some workman's tool." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Gray's face. "Perhaps," she said. "Though I did hear something curious, that someone was seen near the vicarage last night, moving toward your lane. You didn't notice anything, did you?" Mrs. Gray's hand paused, the teapot hovering mid-air. "Near my lane? No. I was asleep by then. Who said such a thing?" "Oh, just village talk," Miss Marple said airily. "You know how it is. Though with your house so close to the vicarage, I thought you might have seen something." Mrs. Gray's eyes narrowed, but she shook her head. "Not a thing. Though I'll tell you, Miss Marple, I don't trust that Mr. Hawthorne, too secretive, by half. If someone was lurking, it was probably him, up to no good." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. Mrs. Gray's quick deflection was telling. She was hiding something, or at least avoiding something. As she left the cottage, Miss Marple's mind turned to the figure in the lane, the glove, and the break-in. They were all connected, she felt certain, but the how and why remained just out of reach. She resolved to keep a closer eye on Mrs. Gray, and to watch the vicarage gate again tonight. In St. Mary Mead, the truth often moved in the shadows, but Miss Marple was adept at bringing it into the light. Chapter 8. The Missing Heirloom. The sun had barely risen over St. Mary Mead, its rays piercing the morning mist to gild the rooftops, when the village was jolted by fresh news. Mrs. Elspeth Gray, usually so composed behind her privet hedge, had marched into the village shop just after opening, her face pale and her voice sharp with indignation, to declare that a valuable family heirloom, a silver locket engraved with her family crest, had been stolen from her cottage. By mid-morning, the gossip had spread like wildfire, fanned by the recent break-in at Mr. Hawthorne's cottage and the lingering mystery of the two-fingered glove. Miss Jane Marple, tending to her garden with a pair of secateurs, heard the news from young Tommy Pierce, who was making his rounds with more enthusiasm than usual. "Mrs. Gray's in a right state, Miss Marple," he called over the gate, his bicycle leaning precariously. "Says her locket's gone, pinched right out of her parlour. Everyone's saying it's that Mr. Hawthorne, first the glove, then his break-in, now this." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles, though her expression remained serene. "A stolen locket, Tommy? That's very serious. Did Mrs. Gray say when she noticed it missing?" Last night, she says, Tommy replied, wiping his nose with a grubby sleeve. Went to polish it before bed and found the box empty. She sets been at the constable sits since dawn, demanding he search Mr. Hawthorne sits place. Thank you, Tommy, Miss Marple said, slipping him a penny. Do be careful with that bicycle, you'll topple over one of these days. As he pedalled off, she set her secateurs aside, her mind already weaving the new thread into the tapestry of the village's mystery. A stolen heirloom, so soon after the break-in and the glove's appearance, was no coincidence. She was certain of it. But was Mr. Hawthorne the thief, or was he, like the glove, a convenient distraction? She decided to visit the village shop, where Mrs. Price would undoubtedly have the latest details. The shop was crowded when she arrived, the air thick with speculation. Mrs. Price stood behind the counter, her hands busy with a ledger, but her tongue busier still. It's a scandal, Miss Marple, she declared as Miss Marple entered. Mrs. Gray's locket, worth a fortune, she says, passed down from her great-grandmother. And to think it was taken right from her parlour. My Tom says, it's got to be that Mr. Hawthorne. Who else could it be? Miss Marple selected a packet of tea, her movements slow and deliberate.
It does seem alarming, she said.
Though I wonder, Mrs. Price, if Mrs. Gray mentioned how the thief got in. Was there a broken window, like at Mr. Hawthorne's sits? Mrs. Price shook her head, her eyes wide. That sits the queer part. No sign of a break-in at all. Mrs. Gray says she locked her doors tight, as always, but the locket was kept in a box on her mantel, plain as day. Whoever took it must sit's known exactly where to look. Miss Marple Sitz's lips curved into a faint smile. How curious, she said. A thief who leaves no trace, and a locket taken from a locked house. It sits almost as if they had a key, or were let in. Mrs. Price gasped, clutching her ledger. Let in? You don't steer means someone Mrs. Gray knows. Oh, Miss Marple, that sets a dreadful thought. Before Miss Marple could reply, the shop bell jingled, and Mrs. Bantry swept in, her cheeks flushed with excitement. Miss Marple, have you heard? Mrs. Gray's locket, stolen. I told Arthur it's all connected. The glove, the break-in, and now this. It's like a plot from one of his wretched novels. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking softly from her basket. It does seem to be piling up, doesn't it? I was just wondering if Mrs. Gray had any visitors recently, someone who might have seen the locket. Mrs. Bantry's eyes lit up. Visitors? Well, now that you mention it, I did see young Mr. Finch, the new postman, leaving her house a few days ago. He was carrying a parcel, but he looked awfully shifty, if you ask me. And of course, there's Mr. Hawthorne, always lurking about. I wouldn't put it past him to know more than he's letting on. Mrs. Price leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. And Dunstead, forget what Mrs. Gray said at your tea, Miss Marple, about seeing Mr. Hawthorne in the woods. Maybe he was casing her house, planning the theft. Miss Marple's expression remained placid, but her mind was racing. The absence of a break-in was significant. It suggested either an inside job or someone with intimate knowledge of Mrs. Gray's habits. She thought of the vicar's tale of the confrontation between Mrs. Gray and Mr. Hawthorne, and her own sighting of a shadowy figure near the vicarage, moving toward Mrs. Gray's lane. Could the locket's theft be tied to that argument, or was it another piece of the puzzle? Determined to learn more, she made her way to Mrs. Gray's cottage that afternoon, armed with a jar of homemade marmalade as an excuse for her visit. Mrs. Gray answered the door, her face drawn and her eyes sharper than ever. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice clipped, "I suppose you've heard about my locket." The whole village is talking, no doubt. I'm so sorry to hear of your loss, Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. It must be very distressing. I wondered if you might tell me more. Perhaps when you last saw it. Mrs. Gray ushered her into the parlour, where the mantel stood conspicuously bare, the empty locket box still in place. It was there 2 days ago, she said, pointing. I check it every week to polish it. Last night, I went to do the same, and it was gone. No broken windows, no forced locks, just gone. Miss Marple's eyes roamed the room, noting the tidy shelves and the locked windows. How extraordinary, she said. And you had no visitors who might have seen it. Mrs. Gray's lips tightened. I don't entertain much, Miss Marple. The postman, Mr. Finch, brought a parcel a few days ago, but he barely stepped inside. And I suppose you've heard the village blaming that Mr. Hawthorne. I wouldn't be surprised. He's been nosing around, asking questions about the village. I told him to mind his own business, but he's not the listening sort. Miss Marple nodded, recalling the vicar Sept's account of their confrontation. I heard you had words with him near the vicarage, she said, her tone light. It must be unsettling, with all this happening. Mrs. Gray's eyes flashed, but she recovered quickly. Words? Oh, that was nothing. Just a disagreement about boundaries. He's too curious for his own good. But if you suggesting I know something about the locket, Miss Marple, I assure you I don't sit. Of course not, Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. I only thought you might have noticed something odd, living so close to the vicarage. That glove, for instance, such a strange thing to find nearby. Mrs. Gray's hand twitched, but her voice remained steady. The glove nothing to do with me. Probably some prank. As for the locket, I told Constable Hurst to search Mr. Hawthorne's cottage. If he got it, they full find it. Miss Marple left the cottage, her mind abuzz. Mrs. Gray's quick deflection of the glove, her insistence on Mr. Hawthorne's guilt, it was all too neat, too rehearsed. She thought of a case her nephew Raymond had once described, where a stolen item was used to frame an innocent party, while the real culprit hid in plain sight. Could Mrs. Gray be orchestrating something similar? And the glove, still unclaimed, seemed to loom larger with each new event. As she walked home, the village settling into the quiet of evening, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the shadowy figure she'd seen by the vicarage gate. Was it Mr. Hawthorne, Mrs. Gray, or someone else entirely? The locket's theft, like the glove, and the break-in, felt deliberate, a move in a game she was only beginning to understand. She resolved to speak with Mr. Finch, the postman, and to keep a closer watch on Mrs. Gray. In St. Mary Mead, the truth was often buried beneath layers of propriety, but Miss Marple had a knack for digging it out. Chapter 9. The Second Glove. The church of St. Mary Mead, with its ancient stone walls and stained glass windows, was a place of solace and tradition, its pews worn smooth by generations of villagers. On Sunday morning the congregation gathered for the weekly service, their whispers hushed but fervent, fueled by the recent theft of Mrs. Gray's locket, the break-in at Mr. Hawthorne's cottage, and the lingering mystery of the two-fingered glove. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual pew near the back, her hymn book open, but her eyes alert, sensed the undercurrent of tension beneath the familiar hymns and prayers. As the service ended and the congregation filed out, Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, lingered to tidy the pews, her hands fluttering nervously as she collected stray hymnals. It was then that she let out a small gasp, drawing the attention of those still in the nave, including Miss Marple, who had paused to admire the altar flowers. Mrs. Clement held up a small object, her face pale. "Oh my goodness," she exclaimed. "It's another glove, just like the one by the vicarage." Miss Marple approached, her knitting basket tucked under her arm, her expression one of mild curiosity. The glove, held gingerly in Mrs. Clement's hands, was indeed a twin to the first, black leather, finely made, with only a thumb and forefinger, the remaining digits sewn shut. But this one was for the opposite hand, a right glove, where the first had been a left. It lay crumpled in the pew where Mrs. Gray usually sat, half hidden beneath a cushion. "How extraordinary," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but her eyes sharp, as she examined it. "And you found it just now, Mrs. Clement?" "Yes, just this moment," Mrs. Clement replied, her voice trembling. "I was straightening the pews, and there it was, tucked away like it was meant to be found." "Oh, Miss Marple, what does it mean? First one glove, now another." It sets positively eerie. The small crowd that had gathered, Mrs. Price, Mrs. Bantry, and a few others murmured in agreement, their faces a mix of fascination and unease. Mrs. Price, clutching her prayer book, spoke up. "It's no coincidence, mark my words. 2 gloves now, both with 2 fingers," I said. "From the start, there's something wicked about it. And in Mrs. Gray's pew, too." Mrs. Bantry, her eyes gleaming with excitement, leaned forward. "It sits like a signal. Isn't it? Like something out of one of Arthur Sitt's detective stories. Maybe it sits a code, or a warning. And why Mrs. Gray sits pew? She sits been awfully quiet since her locket was stolen." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile, but her mind was racing. A second glove, identical but for the hand, placed in Mrs. Gray's pew. It was too deliberate to be chance. She thought of the first glove, found near the vicarage, and the break-in at Mr. Hawthorne's cottage, followed by the theft of Mrs. Gray's locket. Now this. The pieces were multiplying, but the pattern was still elusive, like a tapestry seen through fog. "May I see it, Mrs. Clement?" she asked, her tone gentle. The vicar's wife handed her the glove, and Miss Marple examined it closely, noting the same fine leather, the same meticulous stitching. There was a faint mark on the inside of the wrist, a smudge of ink perhaps, or dirt, barely visible, but distinct from the pristine condition of the first glove. She tucked the detail away, her mind turning to a case her nephew Raymond had once mentioned, where a pair of objects, left in separate places, had been used to mislead the police. "It sits very curious," she said, returning the glove to Mrs. Clement. "I wonder if Mrs. Gray has seen it yet. She was at the service, wasn't she?" Mrs. Clement nodded, her hands fluttering. "Oh yes, she was here, sitting right in that pew, but she left quickly after the service, said she wasn't feeling well. I suppose I should take this to her, or perhaps to Leonard. He still got the first one in his study." Mrs. Price snorted. "If you ask me, Mrs. Gray knows more than she's letting on. First her locket, now this glove in her pew, and don't forget what the vicar said. Her arguing with Mr. Hawthorne near the vicarage. I wager they both mixed up in it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, but she said nothing, her needles clicking softly as she retrieved her knitting from her basket. At the mention of Mrs. Gray and Mr. Hawthorne, brought her thoughts back to the vicar's tale of their confrontation and her own sighting of a shadowy figure near the vicarage gate. The second glove, placed so pointedly in Mrs. Gray's pew, felt like a challenge, a move in a game she was only beginning to understand. Determined to learn more, she made her way to Mrs. Gray's cottage that afternoon, under the guise of checking on her health. The village was quiet, the Sunday calm broken only by the distant toll of the church bell. Mrs. Gray answered the door, her face drawn and her eyes sharper than ever. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice crisp but weary, "I suppose you've come about the glove. The whole village will be talking about it by now." "I did hear about it," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "It said such a strange thing, finding another glove in your pew. I thought you might be feeling out of sorts with all this excitement." Mrs. Gray's lips tightened, but she invited Miss Marple inside, where the parlour was as tidy as ever, though the empty locket box on the mantel seemed to loom larger now. "I don't know anything about it," she said, pouring tea with a steady hand. "I sat in my usual pew, as always, and left when the service ended. If someone put that glove there, it's nothing to do with me." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Graysip's face. "Of course," she said, "though it's sect's odd, done sect you think, that it should be so like the first glove. Almost as if someone wanted to draw attention to you or to the vicarage again." Mrs. Graysip's hand paused, the teacup halfway to her lips. "Draw attention? That sip's nonsense. It sip's probably some prankster trying to stir up trouble. Or that Mr. Hawthorne. He sip's been nothing but trouble since he arrived." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Mr. Hawthorne does seem to attract suspicion, though I wonder if the glove might belong to someone else entirely, someone who knows the village well, perhaps." She watched Mrs. Gray closely, noting the slight tightening of her jaw, the quick glance toward the window. "I wouldn't know," Mrs. Gray said, her voice firm. "I've told Constable Hurst everything I know about my locket, and I've nothing to add about gloves. If you sit'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I've not feeling well." Miss Marple rose, her smile as gentle as ever. "Of course, Mrs. Gray. I do hope you feel better soon, and if you remember anything about that glove or anyone near the church, it might be helpful." As she left the cottage, Miss Marple's thoughts were a whirl of possibilities. The second glove placed in Mrs. Gray's pew was no accident. It was a deliberate act, meant to provoke or distract. She thought of a story Sir Henry Clithering had once told her, about a criminal who left paired clues to confuse the police, each one pointing to a different suspect. Could the gloves be such a ploy, designed to shift suspicion between Mrs. Gray and Mr. Hawthorne? And the smudge of ink on the second glove, could it be a clue to its origin, or another misdirection? She resolved to speak with the vicar again, to examine both gloves side by side, and to keep a closer eye on the churchyard. The shadowy figure she'd seen by the vicarage gate, the confrontation between Mrs. Gray and Mr. Hawthorne, the stolen locket, and now a second glove, all were threads in a tapestry that was growing more intricate by the day. Miss Marple, with her quiet ways and unerring instinct, was determined to unravel it, one stitch at a time. Chapter 9. The Second Glove. The church of St. Mary Mead, with its ancient stone walls and stained glass windows, was a place of solace and tradition, its pews worn smooth by generations of villagers. On Sunday morning, the congregation gathered for the weekly service, their whispers hushed but fervent, fueled by the recent theft of Mrs. Gray's locket, the break-in at Mr. Hawthorne's cottage, and the lingering mystery of the two-fingered glove. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual pew near the back, her hymn book open, but her eyes alert, sensed the undercurrent of tension beneath the familiar hymns and prayers. As the service ended, and the congregation filed out, Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, lingered to tidy the pews, her hands fluttering nervously as she collected stray hymnals. It was then that she let out a small gasp, drawing the attention of those still in the nave, including Miss Marple, who had paused to admire the altar flowers. Mrs. Clement held up a small object, her face pale. "Oh my goodness!" she exclaimed. "It's another glove, just like the one by the vicarage." Miss Marple approached, her knitting basket tucked under her arm, her expression one of mild curiosity. The glove, held gingerly in Mrs. Clement's hands, was indeed a twin to the first black leather finely made, with only a thumb and forefinger, the remaining digits sewn shut. But this one was for the opposite hand, a right glove, where the first had been a left. It lay crumpled in the pew, where Mrs. Gray usually sat, half hidden beneath a cushion. "How extraordinary," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but her eyes sharp, as she examined it. "And you found it just now?" "Mrs. Clement?" "Yes, just this moment," Mrs. Clement replied, her voice trembling. "I was straightening the pews, and there it was, tucked away like it was meant to be found." "Oh, Miss Marple, what does it mean? First one glove, now another. It sits positively eerie." The small crowd that had gathered, Mrs. Price, Mrs. Bantry, and a few others, murmured in agreement, their faces a mix of fascination and unease. Mrs. Price, clutching her prayer book, spoke up. "It's no coincidence, mark my words. 2 gloves now, both with 2 fingers. I said, from the start, there's something wicked about it. And in Mrs. Gray's pew too." Mrs. Bantry, her eyes gleaming with excitement, leaned forward. "It sits like a signal, isn't it? Like something out of one of Arthur Sit's detective stories. Maybe it sits a code or a warning." "And why Mrs. Gray sits pew?" "She sits been awfully quiet since her locket was stolen." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile, but her mind was racing. A second glove, identical but for the hand, placed in Mrs. Gray's pew. It was too deliberate to be chance. She thought of the first glove, found near the vicarage, and the break-in at Mr. Hawthorne's cottage, followed by the theft of Mrs. Gray's locket. Now this, the pieces were multiplying, but the pattern was still elusive, like a tapestry seen through fog. "May I see it, Mrs. Clement?" she asked, her tone gentle. The vicar's wife handed her the glove, and Miss Marple examined it closely, noting the same fine leather, the same meticulous stitching. There was a faint mark on the inside of the wrist, a smudge of ink perhaps, or dirt, barely visible, but distinct from the pristine condition of the first glove. She tucked the detail away, her mind turning to a case her nephew Raymond had once mentioned, where a pair of objects, left in separate places, had been used to mislead the police. "That's very curious," she said, returning the glove to Mrs. Clement. "I wonder if Mrs. Gray has seen it yet." "She was at the service, said she. Mrs. Clement nodded, her hands fluttering. "Oh yes, she was here, sitting right in that pew. But she left quickly after the service, said she wasn't feeling well. I suppose I should take this to her. Or perhaps to Leonard. He's still got the first one in his study." Mrs. Price snorted. "If you ask me, Mrs. Gray knows more than she sits letting on. First her locket, now this glove in her pew. And don't forget what the vicar said, her arguing with Mr. Hawthorne near the vicarage. I wager they sit both mixed up in it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, but she said nothing, her needles clicking softly as she retrieved her knitting from her basket. The mention of Mrs. Gray and Mr. Hawthorne brought her thoughts back to the vicar's tale of their confrontation and her own sighting of a shadowy figure near the vicarage gate. The second glove, placed so pointedly in Mrs. Gray's pew, felt like a challenge, a move in a game she was only beginning to understand. Determined to learn more, she made her way to Mrs. Gray's cottage that afternoon, under the guise of checking on her health. The village was quiet, the Sunday calm, broken only by the distant toll of the church bell. Mrs. Gray answered the door, her face drawn and her eyes sharper than ever. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice crisp but weary, "I suppose you've come about the glove. The whole village will be talking about it by now." "I did hear about it," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "It's such a strange thing, finding another glove in your pew. I thought you might be feeling out of sorts with all this excitement." Mrs. Gray's lips tightened, but she invited Miss Marple inside, where the parlour was as tidy as ever, though the empty locket box on the mantel seemed to loom larger now. "I don't know anything about it," she said, pouring tea with a steady hand. "I sat in my usual pew as always, and left when the service ended. If someone put that glove there, it's nothing to do with me." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Graysip's face. "Of course," she said, "though it seems odd, don't set you think, that it should be so like the first glove. Almost as if someone wanted to draw attention to you, or to the vicarage again." Mrs. Graysip's hand paused, the teacup halfway to her lips. "Draw attention? That sips nonsense. It sips probably some prankster trying to stir up trouble. Or that Mr. Hawthorne. He sips been nothing but trouble since he arrived." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Mr. Hawthorne does seem to attract suspicion, though I wonder if the glove might belong to someone else entirely. Someone who knows the village well, perhaps." She watched Mrs. Gray closely, noting the slight tightening of her jaw, the quick glance toward the window. "I wouldn't stay no," Mrs. Gray said, her voice firm. "I stev told Constable Hurst everything I know about my locket, and I stev nothing to add about gloves. If you still excuse me, Miss Marple, I stev not feeling well." Miss Marple rose, her smile as gentle as ever. "Of course, Mrs. Gray. I do hope you feel better soon. And if you remember anything about that glove or anyone near the church, it might be helpful." As she left the cottage, Miss Marple's thoughts were a whirl of possibilities. The second glove, placed in Mrs. Gray's pew, was no accident. It was a deliberate act, meant to provoke or distract. She thought of a story Sir Henry Clithering had once told her about a criminal who left paired clues to confuse the police, each one pointing to a different suspect. Could the gloves be such a ploy, designed to shift suspicion between Mrs. Gray and Mr. Hawthorne? And the smudge of ink on the second glove, could it be a clue to its origin, or another misdirection? She resolved to speak with the vicar again, to examine both gloves side by side, and to keep a closer eye on the churchyard. The shadowy figure she'd seen by the vicarage gate, the confrontation between Mrs. Gray and Mr. Hawthorne, the stolen locket, and now a second glove. All were threads in a tapestry that was growing more intricate by the day. Miss Marple, with her quiet ways and unerring instinct, was determined to unravel it, one stitch at a time. Chapter 10. A Pattern Emerges. The late afternoon sun bathed St. Mary Mead in a golden haze, softening the edges of the village's cottages and casting long shadows across the lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat in her sitting room, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, though her hands moved almost automatically as her mind wove together the threads of the mystery that had gripped the village. The glove with 2 fingers, the break-in at Mr. Hawthorne's cottage, the stolen locket from Mrs. Gray's parlour, and now the second glove found in Mrs. Gray's church pew, all were pieces of a puzzle that to Miss Marple were beginning to form a discernible pattern. She had spent the morning rereading a letter from her nephew Raymond West, whose work as a writer often brought him into contact with curious cases. One in particular, mentioned in passing during a visit last summer, had stayed with her, a theft in a small town, where a series of odd objects, a broken watch, a single shoe, had been left at the scenes of minor crimes, each one designed to distract from a larger scheme. The gloves, with their peculiar 2-fingered design, felt eerily similar, as if someone were orchestrating a series of events to mislead or provoke. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and reached for her notebook, a small, leather-bound volume where she jotted down thoughts that needed sorting. She wrote, "Glove 1, Vicarage Path, left hand, fine leather, deliberate placement. Glove 2, Mrs. Gray's pew, right hand, smudge of ink. Break-in Mr. Hawthorne's cottage, nothing stolen, locked study. Locket, Mrs. Gray's parlour, no forced entry. Confrontation Mrs. Gray and Mr. Hawthorne, near vicarage. Shadowy figure, near vicarage gate, moving toward Mrs. Gray's lane." She paused, her pen hovering over the page, then added, "Pattern? Distraction, or signal." The similarities to Raymond's case were striking. In that instance, the odd objects had been used to draw attention away from a smuggler's operation, each one placed to keep the police chasing false leads. Could the gloves be serving a similar purpose in St. Mary Mead? The break-in at Mr. Hawthorne's cottage with nothing taken, and the theft of Mrs. Gray's locket, with no sign of forced entry, suggested a careful hand at work, someone who knew the village and its rhythms. Determined to test her theory, Miss Marple decided to visit the vicarage again, to examine both gloves side by side. She found Mrs. Clement in the garden, pruning roses with a distracted air, her usual fluttery demeanour tempered by worry. "Oh, Miss Marple!" she exclaimed, brushing dirt from her hands. "I'm so glad you're here." Leonard's beside himself with these gloves. "First one, now 2. He says it's like a curse on the vicarage." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. "Not a curse, Mrs. Clement, just a puzzle. Might I see both gloves? I understand they sit still in the vicarsept study." Mrs. Clement nodded, leading her inside to the familiar study, where the air smelled of old books and wax polish. The vicar was absent, but the wooden box containing the first glove sat on his desk, joined now by a second box holding its twin. Miss Marple opened both, placing the gloves side by side. The left glove, found by the vicarage gate, was pristine, its leather smooth and unblemished. The right glove, from Mrs. Gray's pew, bore the faint smudge of ink she'd noticed before, along with a tiny tear at the seam of the thumb, barely visible. "How curious," she murmured, her fingers tracing the air above the gloves. "They sit a pair, clearly, but not quite identical. This smudge and this tear, small things, but they tell a story." Mrs. Clement wrung her hands. "A story? Oh, Miss Marple, you make it sound so intriguing, but it sits all so unsettling. Why would someone leave these gloves here, of all places? And in Mrs. Gray's pew, it sits almost as if someone sits pointing at her." Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. "Or away from someone else," she said. In my experience, Mrs. Clement, people leave clues for all sorts of reasons, to accuse, to distract, or to confuse. These gloves feel like a message, but to whom and why? As she spoke, her mind drifted to the break-in at Mr. Hawthorne's cottage. The locked study, the lack of stolen items. It suggested the intruder was looking for something specific, perhaps something hidden among his papers. And Mrs. Gray's locket, taken from a locked house, with no sign of entry, implied someone with access or knowledge. She thought of the confrontation the vicar had overheard, Mrs. Gray's sharp words about keeping promises, and Mr. Hawthorne's warning to leave it alone. Could the gloves be part of their dispute, or a signal to someone else? Leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple decided to speak with Mr. Finch, the new postman, who had been seen at Mrs. Gray's cottage before the locket's theft. She found him at the post office, sorting letters with a nervous energy that made his hands tremble. He was a young man, barely 20, with a pale face and a habit of glancing over his shoulder. "Good afternoon, Mr. Finch," Miss Marple said, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze. "I understand you've been delivering parcels to Mrs. Gray lately. I wonder if you noticed anything unusual, perhaps someone near her cottage, or anything out of the ordinary." Mr. Finch's eyes darted to the side, but he managed a smile. "Nothing much, Miss Marple. Just dropped off a parcel a few days ago, some books," she said. "I didn't see no one else, though Mrs. Gray was in a bit of a state, talking about that Mr. Hawthorne. Said he'd been asking too many questions. Pâté stew." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking softly from her basket. "Questions? How interesting. Did she say what about?" Mr. Finch shrugged, his fingers fumbling with a letter. "Something about her family, I think. Didn't stet catch it all. I was in a hurry, but she wasn't stet happy. That stet's for sure." As Miss Marple left the post office, her thoughts were a whirl of connections. All Mr. Hawthorne's questions, Mrs. Gray's agitation, the gloves, the locket, the break-in, all seemed to circle around a secret, one that someone was going to great lengths to protect or expose. She recalled Raymond's case again, where the smuggler had used paired objects to signal his accomplices. The gloves, one near the vicarage and one in Mrs. Gray's pew, could be such signals, but for what purpose? And the smudge of ink on the second glove, could it point to a specific place, like a printer's shop, or even Mr. Hawthorne's study? She decided to take a detour, past the Miller cottage, where Mr. Hawthorne lived. The boarded-up window from the break-in was still in place, but the cottage was quiet, its curtains drawn. As she passed, she noticed a scrap of paper caught in the hedge, its edge marked with a faint smudge that reminded her of the glove. She retrieved it carefully, noting a few illegible words scrawled in ink, and tucked it into her basket. It was a small thing, but Miss Marple knew that small things often led to great revelations. Back at her cottage, she sat by the fire, her notebook open once more. The pattern was emerging, she felt certain, a web of misdirection, with the gloves as its most visible threads. But who was the spider, and what was their aim? Mr. Hawthorne, with his locked study and secretive ways. Mrs. Gray, with her missing locket and sharp denials. Or someone else, lurking in the shadows she'd seen by the vicarage gate. Miss Marple's needles clicked on, her mind as sharp as ever, determined to unravel the truth hidden in the quiet corners of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 10. A Pattern Emerges. The late afternoon sun bathed St. Mary Mead in a golden haze, softening the edges of the village's cottages and casting long shadows across the lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat in her sitting room, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, though her hands moved almost automatically as her mind wove together the threads of the mystery that had gripped the village. The glove with 2 fingers, the break-in at Mr. Hawthorne's cottage, the stolen locket from Mrs. Gray's parlour, and now the second glove found in Mrs. Gray's church pew, all were pieces of a puzzle that to Miss Marple were beginning to form a discernible pattern. She had spent the morning rereading a letter from her nephew Raymond West, whose work as a writer often brought him into contact with curious cases. One in particular, mentioned in passing during a visit last summer, had stayed with her, a theft in a small town where a series of odd objects, a broken watch, a single shoe, had been left at the scenes of minor crimes, each one designed to distract from a larger scheme. The gloves, with their peculiar 2-fingered design, felt eerily similar, as if someone were orchestrating a series of events to mislead or provoke. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and reached for her notebook, a small, leather-bound volume where she jotted down thoughts that needed sorting. She wrote, "Glove 1, Vicarage Path, left hand fine leather, deliberate placement. Glove 2, Mrs. Gray's pew, right hand smudge of ink, break in Mr. Hawthorne's cottage, nothing stolen, locked study, locket, Mrs. Gray's parlour, no forced entry. Confrontation, Mrs. Gray and Mr. Hawthorne, near Vicarage. Shadowy figure, near Vicarage gate, moving toward Mrs. Gray's lane." She paused, her pen hovering over the page, then added, "Pattern, distraction, or signal." The similarities to Raymond's case were striking. In that instance, the odd objects had been used to draw attention away from a smuggler's operation, each one placed to keep the police chasing false leads. Could the gloves be serving a similar purpose in St. Mary Mead? The break-in at Mr. Hawthorne's cottage with nothing taken, and the theft of Mrs. Gray's locket with no sign of forced entry suggested a careful hand at work, someone who knew the village and its rhythms. Determined to test her theory, Miss Marple decided to visit the vicarage again to examine both gloves side by side. She found Mrs. Clement in the garden, pruning roses with a distracted air, her usual fluttery demeanour tempered by worry. "Oh, Miss Marple," she exclaimed, brushing dirt from her hands. "I'm so glad you're here. Leonard's beside himself with these gloves. First one, now 2. He says it's like a curse on the vicarage." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. "Not a curse, Mrs. Clement, just a puzzle. Might I see both gloves? I understand they sit still in the Vicasset study." Mrs. Clement nodded, leading her inside to the familiar study, where the air smelled of old books and wax polish. The vicar was absent, but the wooden box containing the first glove sat on his desk, joined now by a second box, holding its twin. Miss Marple opened both, placing the gloves side by side. The left glove, found by the vicarage gate, was pristine, its leather smooth and unblemished. The right glove, from Mrs. Gray's pew, bore the faint smudge of ink she'd noticed before, along with a tiny tear at the seam of the thumb, barely visible. "How curious," she murmured, her fingers tracing the air above the gloves. "They set repair, clearly, but not quite identical. This smudge and this tear, small things, but they tell a story." Mrs. Clement wrung her hands. "A story? Oh, Miss Marple, you make it sound so intriguing, but it sits all so unsettling. Why would someone leave these gloves here, of all places? And in Mrs. Gray's pew, it sits almost as if someone sits pointing at her." Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful or away from someone else, she said. In my experience, Mrs. Clement, people leave clues for all sorts of reasons, to accuse, to distract, or to confuse. These gloves feel like a message. But to whom and why? As she spoke, her mind drifted to the break-in at Mr. Hawthorne's cottage. The locked study, the lack of stolen items. It suggested the intruder was looking for something specific, perhaps something hidden among his papers. And Mrs. Gray's locket, taken from a locked house with no sign of entry, implied someone with access or knowledge. She thought of the confrontation the vicar had overheard, Mrs. Gray's sharp words about keeping promises, and Mr. Hawthorne's warning to leave it alone. Could the gloves be part of their dispute, or a signal to someone else? Leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple decided to speak with Mr. Finch, the new postman who had been seen at Mrs. Gray's cottage before the locket's theft. She found him at the post office, sorting letters with a nervous energy that made his hands tremble. He was a young man, barely 20, with a pale face and a habit of glancing over his shoulder. "Good afternoon, Mr. Finch," Miss Marple said, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze. "I understand you've been delivering parcels to Mrs. Gray lately. I wonder if you noticed anything unusual, perhaps someone near her cottage, or anything out of the ordinary." Mr. Finch's eyes darted to the side, but he managed a smile. "Nothing much, Miss Marple. Just dropped off a parcel a few days ago. Some books," she said. "I didn't see no one else." Though Mrs. Gray was in a bit of a state, talking about that Mr. Hawthorne. Said he'd been asking too many questions. "Kadak, Mr. Cirque." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking softly from her basket. "Questions? How interesting. Did she say what about?" Mr. Finch shrugged, his fingers fumbling with a letter. "Something about her family, I think. Didn't catch it all. I was in a hurry, but she wasn't happy. That's for sure." As Miss Marple left the post office, her thoughts were a whirl of connections. Mr. Hawthorne's questions, Mrs. Gray's agitation, the gloves, the locket, the break-in, all seemed to circle around a secret, one that someone was going to great lengths to protect or expose. She recalled Raymond's case again, where the smuggler had used paired objects to signal his accomplices. The gloves, one near the vicarage and one in Mrs. Gray's pew, could be such signals, but for what purpose? And the smudge of ink on the second glove, could it point to a specific place, like a printer's shop or even Mr. Hawthorne's study? She decided to take a detour past the Miller cottage, where Mr. Hawthorne lived. The boarded-up window from the break-in was still in place, but the cottage was quiet, its curtains drawn. As she passed, she noticed a scrap of paper caught in the hedge, its edge marked with a faint smudge that reminded her of the glove. She retrieved it carefully, noting a few illegible words scrawled in ink, and tucked it into her basket. It was a small thing, but Miss Marple knew that small things often led to great revelations. Back at her cottage, she sat by the fire, her notebook open once more. The pattern was emerging. She felt certain, a web of misdirection, with the gloves as its most visible threads. But who was the spider? And what was their aim? Mr. Hawthorne, with his locked study and secretive ways. Mrs. Gray, with her missing locket and sharp denials. Or someone else, lurking in the shadows she'd seen by the vicarage gate. Miss Marple's needles clicked on, her mind as sharp as ever, determined to unravel the truth hidden in the quiet corners of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 12. The Hidden Truth. The soft glow of lamplight filled Miss Jane Marple's sitting room, casting delicate shadows on the chintz curtains as she sat with her knitting, her needles clicking in a steady rhythm. Outside, St. Mary Mead was settling into the quiet of evening, but within her cottage, Miss Marple's mind was anything but still. The mystery of the two-fingered gloves, the break-in at Mr. Hawthorne's cottage, and the theft of Mrs. Gray's locket had woven a complex web, and she was determined to untangle it. The village meeting, with its heated accusations and Mr. Hawthorne's calm denials, had only deepened her suspicion that the truth lay hidden beneath layers of misdirection. Her thoughts kept returning to Mrs. Gray's locket, supposedly a valuable family heirloom, stolen from a locked house with no sign of forced entry. The absence of evidence troubled her, as did Mrs. Gray's fervent insistence on Mr. Hawthorne's guilt. Miss Marple had seen such vehemence before, in a case her friend Sir Henry Clithering had once described, where a stolen jewel was revealed to be a fake, used to manipulate suspicion. Could Mrs. Gray's locket be part of a similar deception? Determined to test her theory, Miss Marple decided to visit Mrs. Price at the village shop, where gossip often revealed more than intended. She arrived just as Mrs. Price was closing up, the shelves neatly stocked, and the air heavy with the scent of fresh bread. "Good evening, Mrs. Price," Miss Marple said, her smile gentle but her eyes sharp. "I was wondering if you might recall anything about Mrs. Gray's locket. Perhaps she mentioned it to you before it was stolen." Mrs. Price, ever eager for a chat, wiped her hands on her apron. "Oh, Miss Marple, that locket's been the talk of the village. Mrs. Gray used to show it off, now and then silver, she said, with her family crest, worth a pretty penny. But I'll tell you something odd. My Tom's cousin, who's a jeweller in Much Benham, saw it once when Mrs. Gray brought it in for cleaning, years ago. He said it didn't look like real silver to him, more like plated metal, though he didn't dare say so to her face." Miss Marple Sip's needles paused, her mind seizing on the detail. Plated metal. How interesting. Did he mention anything else, perhaps about the crest? Mrs. Price frowned, thinking, not much, only that the engraving looked a bit crude, like it wasn't done by a proper craftsman. Mrs. Gray was so proud of it, though. He didn't press the matter. "Why? Do you think it matters?" "Oh, I don't dull," Miss Marple said airily, though her thoughts were anything but idle. "It's doubts, just curious. It's just it, that a valuable heirloom might not be what it seems. Thank you, Mrs. Price. You've been most helpful." As she left the shop, Miss Marple's mind was abuzz. A locket that wasn't silver, with a crude engraving. It suggested Mrs. Gray's heirloom was a fake, or at least not as valuable as she claimed. Why, then, make such a fuss about its theft? And why point the finger so firmly at Mr. Hawthorne? She thought of the gloves, both found in places tied to Mrs. Gray, the vicarage path near her lane, and her church pew. Could the locket's theft be a ploy to shift suspicion or to cover something else? Determined to confirm her suspicions, Miss Marple paid a discreet visit to Mrs. Bantry at Gossington Hall, knowing her friend's knack for remembering village history. Over tea in the grand drawing-room, Miss Marple steered the conversation to Mrs. Gray's family. "I've been wondering about Mrs. Gray's locket," she said, her tone light. "She speaks of it as a family heirloom, but I don't recall her mentioning her family much. Do you know anything about her background?" Mrs. Bantry, delighted to be consulted, leaned forward. "Well, now that you mention it, Miss Marple, Mrs. Gray's always been a bit cagey about her past. She came to St. Mary Mead about 10 years ago, after her husband died, and said she was from a good family up north, Yorkshire, I think. But I remember Mrs. Clement saying once that Mrs. Gray's stories about her family didn't quite add up, something about a crest that didn't match any known lineage. I thought it was just her being proud, but now with the locket stolen, do you think it's important? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Everything sits important until it isn't, sits Mrs. Bantry. Though I must say a locket that sits not what it seems does make one wonder about its owner's intentions. Armed with this new insight, Miss Marple decided to examine the scrap of paper she'd found near Mr. Hawthorne's cottage, which bore a smudge of ink like the one on the second glove. Back at her cottage, she spread it out under a magnifying glass, noting the faint scrawled words, "Meet, Dusk, Vicarage." The handwriting was shaky, almost illegible, but the ink matched the smudge on the glove, a dark bluish hue not common in the village. Hawthorne's locked study, filled with manuscripts, and wondered if the paper had come from there, or if it had been planted to implicate him. The next morning she visited the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement was arranging flowers for the altar. "Mrs. Clement," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle, "I have been thinking about Mrs. Gray Sip's locket. Has she ever shown it to you? Perhaps described it in detail?" Mrs. Clement paused, her hands full of roses. "Not really, Miss Marple. She mentioned it was silver with a crest, but I never saw it close up. She was very protective of it, always kept it in that box on her mantle." "Why do you ask?" "Oh, just a thought," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "I wondered if it might have been misplaced, rather than stolen. Sometimes things aren't what they seem." Mrs. Clement's eyes widened. "Misplaced? Oh, Miss Marple, you don't think Mrs. Gray could have made it up? But why?" Miss Marple did not answer directly, but her mind was racing. A fake locket, a staged theft, 2 peculiar gloves, a break-in with nothing taken. It all pointed to a deception, one that Mrs. Gray and perhaps Mr. Hawthorne were entangled in. She recalled a case her nephew Raymond had once shared, where a woman had claimed a theft to cover her own misdeeds, using a fake heirloom to gain sympathy and divert suspicion. Could Mrs. Gray be playing a similar game, with the gloves as part of the ruse? Determined to test her theory, Miss Marple spoke with Constable Hurst later that day, catching him outside the village hall. "Constable," she said, her tone mild, "have you had any luck with Mrs. Gray's locket? I was wondering if it might be worth checking her cottage again. Sometimes things are overlooked." Constable Hurst frowned, scratching his head. "We searched thoroughly, Miss Marple, but I suppose it wouldn't hurt to look again. Mrs. Gray's been so insistent. It's Mr. Hawthorne, but we've found nothing at his place either. Those gloves, though, they're the queerest part. Why leave them where they'd be found?" Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "Why, indeed. Perhaps they meant to keep us looking in one direction, while the truth lies elsewhere." As she walked home, the pieces were falling into place. The locket, likely a fake, suggested Mrs. Gray was hiding something, perhaps a motive for accusing Mr. Hawthorne. The gloves, with their deliberate placement, felt like markers in a larger scheme, possibly tied to the confrontation the vicar had overheard. And the scrap of paper, with its cryptic message, hinted at a meeting, perhaps one that had gone wrong. Miss Marple sat by her fire that evening, her notebook open. She wrote, "Locket, likely fake, per jeweler's comment. Mrs. Gray's accusations, too fervent, staged, gloves, signals, or distractions. paper, from Mr. Hawthorne's study, or planted. The pattern was clearer now, a web of deception, with Mrs. Gray at its heart. But Mr. Hawthorne's role was still uncertain. Was he a victim, a conspirator, or something else entirely? Miss Marple's needles clicked on, her mind as sharp as ever, determined to uncover the final truth before the village's suspicions spiraled out of control. Chapter 13. The Final Twist. The vicarage drawing-room was filled with an air of anticipation, the soft glow of lamplight casting flickering shadows on the walls. Miss Jane Marple had requested a gathering, ostensibly to discuss the church fete, but the true purpose was clear to all who attended, to unravel the mystery that had gripped St. Mary Mead. The two-fingered gloves, the break-in at Mr. Hawthorne's cottage, the theft of Mrs. Gray's locket, all had stirred the village into a frenzy of suspicion, and Miss Marple, with her quiet ways and sharp mind, was ready to lay the truth bare. Seated around the room were the key figures: Mrs. Elspeth Gray, her posture rigid and her eyes sharp; Mr. Cedric Hawthorne, his long coat draped over a chair, his face a mask of guarded calm; the Reverend Leonard Clement and his wife Clara, both visibly anxious; Mrs. Bantry, her eyes gleaming with excitement; and Constable Hurst, his notebook at the ready. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking softly, her expression serene, but her gaze piercing. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice gentle but carrying that quiet authority that silenced the room. "St. Mary Mead has been troubled by recent events, the gloves, the break-in, the locket, and I believe it's time we sorted out the truth. It's often the smallest things, you know, that reveal the most." Mrs. Gray Sipp's lips tightened. "If you said suggesting I know something, Miss Marple." "I told the constable everything. My locket was stolen, and I'm certain Mr. Hawthorne is involved." Mr. Hawthorne. Sid's eyes flashed, but his voice remained steady. "I said from the start, Mrs. Gray, that I know nothing of your locket or those gloves. I'm here to work, not to stir up trouble." Miss Marple raised a hand, her smile disarming. "Let's not rush to accusations. Let's begin with the gloves, such peculiar things, with only 2 fingers. The first was found by the vicarage gate, the second in Mrs. Gray's pew. They're a pair, clearly, but why leave them where they'd be found? I wondered if they were a distraction, meant to keep us looking one way, while the real truth lay elsewhere." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice eager. "A distraction? Oh, Miss Marple, you make it sound like one of Arthur Sipt's novels. But a distraction from what?" Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes scanning the room. "From a deception, Mrs. Bantry. Let's consider the locket. Mrs. Gray, you described it as a valuable family heirloom, silver with a crest. Yet I learned from Mrs. Price that a jeweller in Much Benham, who saw it years ago, thought it was merely plated metal, with a crude engraving, not the treasure you claimed." Mrs. Gray Sipp's face paled, her hands clenching in her lap. "That's Sipp's nonsense. My locket is a family heirloom, worth a great deal. I don't know what that jeweller was talking about." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her gaze was unwavering. "Perhaps, but it's curious, isn't it, that your house showed no sign of a break-in. A locket taken from a locked cottage with no forced entry suggests someone with access, or that it was never stolen at all." The room gasped, and Mrs. Gray Sipp's voice rose. "Never stolen? Are you accusing me of lying, Miss Marple?" "Not lying, Mrs. Gray," Miss Marple said calmly, "but perhaps orchestrating Let me explain. The gloves, the break-in, the locket, they're all connected, but not in the way we first thought. I found a scrap of paper near Mr. Hawthorne's cottage, with a smudge of ink matching the one on the second glove. The paper had a note, "Meet, dusk, vicarage." It suggested a rendezvous, one that tied to the confrontation you had with Mr. Hawthorne, overheard by the vicar. Mr. Hawthorne shifted, his eyes narrowing. "I told you, Miss Marple, that was nothing, a disagreement about local history. I'm an antiquarian, researching manuscripts, not stealing lockets." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, Mr. Hawthorne. But your manuscripts are part of this. You see, I believe Mrs. Gray staged the theft of her locket, a fake locket, to accuse you, Mr. Hawthorne, and distract from her own actions. The gloves were her idea, left to create a mystery, to make the village suspect you. But the real deception was about something far more valuable." Mrs. Clement gasped, her hands fluttering. "More valuable? Miss Marple, what do you mean?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Mrs. Gray, you came to St. Mary Mead 10 years ago, claiming a distinguished family background. But your stories, as Mrs. Bantry noted, didn't quite add up. I suspect you were once involved with a man, a forger perhaps, who created the locket to bolster your claim to a grand lineage. When Mr. Hawthorne arrived, asking questions about local families for his research, you feared he'd uncover your past. You argued with him near the vicarage, as the vicar heard, demanding he keep promises, perhaps a promise to stay silent about what he knew." Mrs. Gray's face was ashen, but she said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line. Mr. Hawthorne's expression was unreadable, though his gloved hands tightened on the chair. Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. "The break-in at Mr. Hawthorne's cottage was no burglary. It was you, Mrs. Gray, searching his study for papers that might expose you. You broke the window to make it look convincing, but took nothing because you didn't find what you were looking for. The gloves were your creation, left to sow confusion, one by the vicarage to stir gossip, the other in your pew to make it seem you were a victim. But the ink smudge on the second glove, matching the paper I found, betrayed you. You wrote that note, arranging a meeting with Mr. Hawthorne, hoping to confront him again." Constable Hurst's teared eyes widened. "Mrs. Gray, but why go to all that trouble? And the locket, what set's it got to do with it?" Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. "The locket was the key, Constable. By claiming it was stolen, Mrs. Gray could accuse Mr. Hawthorne, keeping the village focused on him while she searched for any evidence he might have, perhaps a letter or document tying her to her true past. But the locket was never stolen. I suspect, Mrs. Gray, that it's still in your cottage, hidden where no one would look." Mrs. Gray rose, her voice trembling with fury. "This is outrageous. I once sit here and be slandered. My locket was stolen, and I demand." Miss Marple raised a hand, her voice cutting through the outburst. "If I may, Constable, I suggest you search Mrs. Graystet's cottage again, perhaps under the floorboards in her parlour near the mantel. You might find something interesting." The room fell silent, all eyes on Mrs. Gray, who stood frozen, her face a mask of shock. Constable Hurst nodded, his notebook snapping shut. "Right, Miss Marple. I shall do it now. Mrs. Gray, you sit better come with me." As the constable led Mrs. Gray out, the room erupted in whispers. Mrs. Bantry clapped her hands, her eyes shining. "Miss Marple, you sit her a marvel. A fake locket, a staged theft. It steps like something out of a play." Mr. Hawthorne spoke at last, his voice low. "You're quite remarkable, Miss Marple. I confess, I suspected Mrs. Gray was hiding something, but I had no proof. My research uncovered a forgery ring from years ago, and her name appeared in some old letters. I only wanted to verify it, not expose her." Thus, Miss Marple Sit's needles resumed their rhythm. "People often fear exposure, Mr. Hawthorne, even when it sits unwarranted. Mrs. Gray went to great lengths to protect her secret, but secrets have a way of coming out." Later that evening, Constable Hurst returned to confirm Miss Marple's suspicions. The locket, plated metal and crudely engraved, was found hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Mrs. Gray's parlour, along with a small cache of forged documents linking her to a past she'd tried to bury. The gloves, it turned out, were custom-made by a tailor in Much Benham, commissioned by Mrs. Gray to create a mystery that would distract the village. As the vicarage emptied, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting in her lap. The truth had been simpler than the village's wild theories, yet more complex than they'd imagined, a tale of fear, deception, and a woman's desperate bid to protect a fabricated past. Mary Mead, the smallest clues had led to the greatest revelations, and Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom, had seen them all. Chapter 14. Resolution in St. Mary Mead. The late summer sun had returned to St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a gentle glow that seemed to wash away the shadows of the past weeks. The mystery of the two-fingered gloves, the break-in at Mr. Hawthorne's cottage, and the supposed theft of Mrs. Gray's locket had been laid bare, thanks to Miss Jane Marple's quiet persistence and unerring insight. The village, once buzzing with suspicion and gossip, was settling back into its familiar rhythm, though the echoes of the affair lingered in whispered conversations and curious glances. Miss Marple sat in her garden, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue scarf, her eyes drifting to the roses that bloomed in orderly rows. The revelation at the vicarage had caused a stir, but not the chaos one might expect. Mrs. Elspeth Gray, confronted with the discovery of her fake locket and forged documents, had confessed to Constable Hurst, not to theft, but to a desperate attempt to protect a past she'd invented. She had come to St. Mary Mead a decade ago, fleeing a life tied to a minor forgery ring in Yorkshire, and had crafted a new identity as a woman of means and lineage. The locket, a cheap creation meant to bolster her story, had been her talisman, and Mr. Hawthorne's questions about local families had threatened to unravel it all. The gloves, as Miss Marple had deduced, were Mrs. Gray's invention, commissioned from a tailor in Much Benham to create a mystery that would distract the village and cast suspicion on Mr. Hawthorne. The break-in at his cottage had been her doing, a clumsy attempt to find any papers that might expose her. The note Miss Marple had found, with its smudged ink and cryptic message, had been a draft of her attempt to lure Mr. Hawthorne to a confrontation, though she'd lost her nerve and discarded it. The second glove, placed in her own pew, was meant to make her seem a victim, but the ink smudge, a careless slip from her own pen, had betrayed her. Miss Marple had visited the vicarage that morning, where Mrs. Clement, still recovering from the shock, was arranging flowers with a newfound calm. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her hands less fluttery than usual, "I can't thank you enough. Leonard was so worried, but now the village feels lighter somehow. Though I feel for Mrs. Gray, she must have been so frightened." Miss Marple Sit's eyes crinkled with a gentle smile. "Fear makes people do strange things. Mrs. Clement, Mrs. Gray, wanted to protect her place in St. Mary Mead, but secrets have a way of surfacing. Don't sit they? I stun, just glad it sits over. Mrs. Bantry, who had stopped by the vicarage with a basket of apples from Gossington Hall, was less forgiving. Frightened or not, she caused a right mess, she declared, her voice carrying across the garden. All that fuss over a fake locket and those dreadful gloves. Though I must say, Miss Marple, you were brilliant. Arthur says it's better than any of his detective novels. Miss Marple chuckled softly, her needles never pausing. A set no detective, Mrs. Bantry. I just notice things, small things, like the way people speak or avoid speaking. It sets human nature, really, that tells the story. Mr. Hawthorne, too, had come to thank her, stopping by her cottage that afternoon. He was less guarded now, his long coat replaced by a lighter jacket, though his left hand still bore a glove, ordinary, with all 5 fingers. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low but sincere, "I owe you an apology. I should have been more forthcoming about my research. I suspected Mrs. Gray's past, but I didn't want to stir up trouble. You've saved me a great deal of bother." Miss Marple's smile was warm but knowing. "No trouble at all, Mr. Hawthorne, though I must say, your locked study did make people curious. Perhaps next time you sit'll share a bit more with your neighbours." He laughed, a rare sound that softened his sharp features. "Perhaps I will. St. Mary Mead has taught me a lesson about secrets and about the sharpness of village minds." As he left, Miss Marple reflected on the case. Mrs. Gray had agreed to leave St. Mary Mead quietly, her confession sparing her legal consequences, but not the village's judgment. The gloves were returned to the tailor, who admitted to making them at her request, and the locket, a sad relic of her deception, was tucked away in Constable Hurst's evidence box. The break-in, the confrontation, the shadowy figure Miss Marple had seen by the vicarage gate, all were pieces of Mrs. Gray's desperate bid to protect a lie, unravelled by the smallest details, an ink smudge, a crude engraving, a discarded note. That evening, as she sat by her fire, Miss Marple opened her notebook, crossing out the final entries. Locket, fake, hidden by Mrs. Gray, gloves. Her creation to distract, break-in, staged to search Mr. Hawthorne's study. Truth, Mrs. Gray's past, exposed. She closed the book, her thoughts drifting to a story her nephew Raymond had once told her, about a woman whose fear of exposure led to a cascade of mistakes. Human nature, she mused, was the same everywhere, full of hopes and fears, secrets and slip-ups, waiting for someone to notice. St. Mary Mead was quiet again, its lanes peaceful, its gossip turning to milder matters, the church fete, the new postman's clumsiness, but Miss Marple knew that quiet was never permanent. In a village, as in life, there were always threads waiting to be pulled, and she would be there, with her knitting and her sharp eyes, ready to unravel them. And so the mystery comes to a close, with St. Mary Mead restored to its tranquil charm. Miss Marple's keen insight has once again uncovered the truth, hidden in the smallest details, proving that no secret can stay buried forever. What did you think of this tale of deception and discovery? Share your thoughts and let us know where you're listening from. Perhaps a quiet village like St. Mary Mead, or a bustling city far away. Subscribe to the channel for more thrilling mysteries, and join us next time as we unravel another puzzle with Miss Marple's unmatched wisdom.